Glen Sheen's technical descriptions, one space is called a winter garden, but elsewhere it's labeled a subway. That word doesn't belong in a 1908 mansion tour, and at some point, someone made sure it stopped belonging. This video examines Glen Sheen, a mansion completed in 1908 on the edge of Lake Superior in Duluth, Minnesota, and it argues something precise. Glen Sheen was not only built to impress, it was built to operate. The mini-verdict is simple. The subway reference wasn't a playful EGU nickname. It reflects an internal logic that modern visitor language tends to flatten into decor and romance. Here is the concrete clue. In technical or architectural descriptions, a feature connected to a winter garden is also treated with the vocabulary of infrastructure, subway. That single word matters because it implies passage, protected circulation, and functional planning, not just ornament. And once you notice it, you can't unsee the conflict. Public-facing narratives sell Glen Sheen as a Jacobean-style showplace, but the building's own language hints at a system designed for winter, distance, and control. To understand why that tension would exist, you have to place Duluth in its moment. In the early 20th century, this city was not a decorative outpost. It was a strategic port tied to Great Lakes industry and capital, and by 1907, the United States had just been shaken by the Panic of 1907, a financial crisis that made liquidity, reputation, and governance feel fragile, even for the wealthy. In that environment, estates were not only homes. They were statements about stability, inheritance, and the ability to outlast volatility. Glen Sheen's patron, Chester Adgate Congdon, hired Clarence H. Johnston Sr., an architect whose work could signal legitimacy as much as taste. And legitimacy, in an era of aggressive press scrutiny and social rigidity, was not optional. A mansion's image could be managed. Its operational design had to function. The question is, why a place that presents itself today as an open, historic estate would carry a term that sounds closer to staff circulation, protected movement, or internal routing, something you would expect in a city building, not a lakeside tour route. Have you ever encountered a record that wasn't meant to survive? Because once the word subway appears, the investigation stops being aesthetic and becomes procedural. Where does it lead? What did it connect? And why does the terminology feel out of place now? We start where any honest inquiry starts, at the point where the public story and the building's own vocabulary disagree, with the lake outside, winter on the horizon, and a single contested space inside the mansion. And that is where the record begins. The paper was thin enough to fold, but heavy enough to suggest permanence. Dated March 12, 1907, it bore the header Clarence H. Johnston, Sr., Architectural Office, St. Paul, Minnesota. The notation halfway down the page seemed routine. A line, referring to subway passage connecting winter garden to service wing. At first glance, it looked like one of dozens of mechanical or foundation notes that appear in any estate blueprint. But the term subway, in this context, didn't fit the era's vocabulary of domestic luxury. It implied motion, logistics, and substructure, something meant to be used, not shown. The document surfaced decades later, misfiled in a box of house papers cataloged for conservation at the Glen Sheen Historic Estate. It wasn't the sort of find that makes headlines. It was a quiet page, unsigned except for an engineer's initials. Yet, in the taxonomy of architecture, a word is never accidental. Johnston's office worked in precise layers, elevations, mechanicals, routing diagrams, and no subway would appear unless the plan required an enclosed movement route, possibly heated or insulated. Charles W. Levitt, Jr., the landscape architect coordinating exterior circulation, referenced protected access between house and outbuildings in one surviving correspondence, aligning with the same date range. By reconstructing the likely route, a pattern emerges. From the mansion's basement-level service corridor, a door leads toward the east garden wall. The notation, subway, appears precisely where a narrow foundation trench transitions beneath grade, toward the greenhouses and the gardener's rooms. In winter, Duluth's temperatures often fell below zero. Servants transporting supplies, or even family members, crossing to the conservatory, would have needed a shielded path. The physical necessity makes sense. What does not is the term's later disappearance. Public tours never mention a subway. The diagrams shown to visitors omit that link, smoothing over what was once a structural artery of the estate. The 1907 record reframes Glen Sheen itself, not as a static symbol of northern opulence but as a coordinated mechanism, a literal machine for living before the phrase entered modernist vocabulary. The Congdon family's reputation was tied to order, productivity, and temperance. A residence that ran like a factory, quiet, invisible, efficient, would have mirrored the industrial ethos of its owner. Yet, when the estate became a public heritage site in the 20th century, the same qualities became inconvenient. Words like subway or service tunnel evoke hierarchy and control, not beauty. In the lexicon of preservation, they vanish. Walking through the reconstructed path on a winter day, the logic sharpens. A person could move from the furnace rooms past coal storage, through a low-vaulted brick tunnel, and emerge near the conservatory's heating plant, without ever entering the ornamental halls. The air would have been warmer than outside, but colder than any occupied space, a perfect no-man's land between the domestic and the industrial. The archival label, subway, was simply the honest term for it. What later guides call the Winter Garden Corridor is a linguistic compromise, chosen to fit the romance expected of a tour. There is a quiet institutional discomfort in admitting that the estate's grace relied on systems designed to conceal labor. Each euphemism, garden link, mechanical passage, restored connector, erases the pragmatic intelligence that made the mansion viable through northern winters. To name it again is to expose an old truth. That luxury required infrastructure, and infrastructure required silence. Would you have left the word subway in the guidebook or replaced it with something easier to admire? By the end of that 1907 document, one annotation has been struck through in pencil. Beneath it, a fainter graphite line adds a single word, revised. No replacement term follows. The change was administrative, not architectural. But in that erasure lies the earliest sign of narrative control. The moment when the house began to describe itself not as a machine, but as a masterpiece. The paper still carries the indentation where the pencil pressed to. Hard. And in that groove, the story of Glen Sheen's concealed movement remains, waiting beneath the floorboards, where the diagrams stopped telling the truth. By 1905, the outlines of Glen Sheen had begun to rise along the frozen shore of Lake Superior, in a city better known for iron, timber, and shipping than for palatial estates. Duluth, barely a generation removed from its boomtown phase, watched the Congdon estate emerge with a mix of awe and suspicion. The local press, proud yet provincial, tracked each shipment of limestone and mahogany as though the construction itself were a civic performance. In that climate, reputation was currency, visible, fragile, and easily distorted. For Chester Adgate Congdon, a lawyer turned industrial investor, building a 39-room mansion in the north carried more than financial risk. It invited interpretation. To be perceived as new power in a region defined by hard labor meant treading a narrow path between success and excess. Congdon's own correspondence from the period hints at this unease. Phrases like sound stewardship and proper example appear frequently, as if the project's moral dimension needed reinforcement. In 1905, when blueprints began circulating among contractors and engineers, visibility itself became dangerous. Elite households of the early 20th century managed that danger through invisibility. Service routes, concealed corridors, and restricted sightlines were not eccentricities. They were instruments of control. At Glensheen, these practices intersected with practical necessity. Duluth's winters could immobilize surface travel for weeks, and to move fuel, linens, or food between outbuildings required protection from snow and sub-zero wind. The subway, as referenced in later documents, offered both utility and discretion, a means to keep the estate functional without breaking the illusion of effortlessness. The design followed an unspoken code inherited from Eastern estates. The fewer servants, seen, the stronger the image of refinement. The winter garden, ostensibly a space for sunlight and leisure, doubled as a boundary line. Beyond it lay infrastructure, pipes, boilers, walkways, hidden behind masonry and frost glass. Guests never crossed that threshold. When Clarence H. Johnston, Sr. and Charles W. Levitt, Jr. coordinated plans, the separation of movement was deliberate. One set of drawings detailed routes of convenience, the other routes of necessity. The public saw only the first. To construct such a house in 1905 was to stage a paradox. Congdon's fortune came from industries that fed on exposure, iron, transportation, commerce, yet his residence was engineered to absorb visibility and neutralize it. The risk was reputational. Too much grandeur invited resentment. Too little undermined status. Duluth's newspapers oscillated between admiration and veiled critique, describing Glen Sheen as both an emblem of northern progress and a monument of singular ambition. Interview response. The family cultivated restraint. Press access was limited to the exterior. Photographers were allowed only on clear days, and none were permitted below ground. The mansion's infrastructure embodied a broader truth about early 20th century wealth. Its stability depended on what could remain unseen. In 1907, as the panic unsettled national markets, discretion became self-preservation. The estate's hidden routes, including the alleged subway, insulated not only people from cold, but also reputation from exposure. Every delivery, every movement of staff, every mechanical failure could occur out of view, maintaining the fiction of permanence. That fiction had a cost. The boundary between household and enterprise blurred. Heating systems were calibrated like industrial plants, schedules synchronized with the Duluth rail depot, and even waste disposal managed through coded ledgers. To the outside world, Glen Sheen was serenity embodied. Internally, it operated under protocols familiar to a company town: efficiency, supervision, and silence. The very feature that kept the household functioning through northern storms also kept its human mechanics invisible. The consequence was social as much as structural. In making the mansion an instrument of control, the Congdon family ensured its continuity, but also its isolation. The architecture that promised refuge became a barrier. Servants entered unseen, workers passed through tunnels, and visitors encountered only curated stillness. In a community where proximity bred familiarity, Glen Sheen's perfection marked it as foreign. That perception, carefully managed through press statements and civic donations, allowed the family to appear both generous and untouchable. When the final sections of stone were set in 1908, the risk had been contained but not erased. Glen Sheen stood as both achievement and defense, a fortress of wealth on the edge of a working port. Its elegance was the product of infrastructure designed to suppress noise, odor, and conflict. The subway that connected warmth to display now symbolized a broader circulation of power, smooth above ground, intricate and unseen below. And somewhere in the estate's early blueprints, a faint pencil line traces that passage still, running under the gardens, past the furnace rooms, toward the lake, an invisible reminder of how reputation once required architecture to do the work silence could not. In 1909, the house was no longer a project. It was a functioning institution with staff routines, visitor expectations, and a growing orbit of acquaintances who understood that being invited to Glen Sheen meant being admitted, briefly, into the Congdon family's version of order. The limestone had settled. The boilers had been tested through a full Duluth winter. The estate had moved from construction language into social language, and that transition created a problem that did not exist on the drafting table. Certain words, perfectly acceptable, inside an architectural office, sounded wrong when repeated outside the household. The surviving trace of that problem is not dramatic. It is administrative. A typed sheet, consistent with early 20th century estate management habits, appears in the same cluster of house papers where the 1907 reference was later found. It is the kind of document that would have been passed from the estate manager to senior household staff, an internal standard, meant to prevent inconsistency. The page is, dated February 1909 and formatted like a set of preferred terms, the sort of vocabulary list a large home uses when it expects visitors, correspondence, and conversation to circulate beyond the walls. It includes banal items: how to refer to the carriage approach, how to describe the receiving hall, which rooms are private versus for company. And then, in the middle of the list, is the item that matters: winter garden, use in all social references. Beneath it, a second line appears, lighter, as if added after the first pass. Do not use subway outside of mechanical or office discussion. No speech is quoted. No emotion is recorded. Yet the choice is unmistakable because the instruction solves a specific reputational risk. In Duluth, words traveled quickly. The regional press was not an abstract force. It was a network of editors, civic boosters, and curious observers who relied on dinner talk and contractor gossip as much as on official statements. If a guest heard the yadim staff refer to as subway, the story could leave the property before the carriage returned to town. The term would invite the wrong questions. Why would a private mansion require a subway? Who moved through it? What did it connect? What was meant to be unseen? For a family navigating the fragile optics of new power on the northern edge of Lake Superior, that was the wrong kind of attention that reframed elegance as mechanism and hospitality as control. The decision then was not about hiding a tunnel. It was about controlling the category the tunnel belonged to. Clarence H. Johnston, Sr. built his drawings to coordinate work. The estate administration had to build a parallel language to coordinate perception. That shift was typical of elite households at the time. Once the last contractor left, a second form of construction began. The construction of a story that could survive social repetition without producing friction. It required standard terms, soft edges, and the removal of anything that sounded industrial, infrastructural, or overly purposeful. Winter garden was safe. It suggested taste, light, refinement. It was consonant with an estate tour. Subway was not safe. It suggested the existence of unseen roots and invisible labor, and it implied that what appeared effortless on the surface was supported by a deliberate system underneath. The mechanism of intervention was practical. The estate manager, acting under household leadership and within the expectations of Chester Congdon, began to standardize how the house was described in invitations, in reception instructions, and in guided movement during social calls. The same internal sheet that defines winter garden also defines who may speak when visitors ask technical questions and which documents are not to be shown. One line, brief and typical of managerial writing, establishes a boundary. Plans kept in office do not circulate. Another assigns responsibility. Questions regarding heating, service routes, or works to be directed to office. The effect is to keep operational knowledge inside the administrative compartment of the estate, away from the social compartment where language could be repeated and reshaped. In this context, the most telling action is a small one: the reclassification of a term. The estate did not need to alter stone or brick to change the public meaning of a space. It only needed to adjust the word that carried the space into conversation. When a e.g. guest asked about the conservatory's warmth in winter, the answer would be framed as comfort and design, not as routing and logistics. When a visitor noticed a door that seemed to lead nowhere, it could be dismissed as service access or storage, not as a deliberate circulation channel. Even among the staff, the instruction worked as discipline. If the vocabulary list was internalized, the household would speak about itself using the same polished terms, reducing the risk of a stray technical word turning into a rumor. This is the point where Glen Sheen becomes two houses at once. There is the house as it functions, an engineered environment in a harsh climate, with protected roots, controlled movement, and the practical architecture required to keep a large estate operating. And there is the house as it is narrated, an expression of taste and status, a setting where wealth appears as culture rather than his system. The decision made in 1909 is the hinge between those two versions. It is also the first layer of what can fairly be called an official history, not in the sense of a published lie, but in the sense of a story that excludes operational truth as a matter of policy. The reason this matters is that policy, once written, replicates. Staff learn the approved terms, new staff inherit them. Guests repeat what they hear. Press descriptions echo the vocabulary available to them. Over time, the absence of a technical term does more than prevent embarrassment. It reshapes what future audiences believe the house was built to do. The mansion becomes a stage set rather than an apparatus. The winter garden becomes a picturesque detail rather than a boundary between display and logistics. And the subway, even if physically unchanged, becomes linguistically unreachable, present in paper that stays in offices and absent from speech that circulates in town. The surviving documents suggest that Chester Congdon understood this dynamic instinctively, not because he feared scandal in the sensational sense, but because he understood that the legitimacy of wealth depended on how wealth appeared. A mansion could be admired if it looked like tradition. It could be resented if it looked like machinery. In 1909, the Congdon estate was still new enough to attract scrutiny, and Duluth was still intimate enough that scrutiny arrived through conversation. The household's response was to preempt awkward categories, to keep the language of infrastructure where it belonged. In the drawers, in offices, and in the private competence of those who ran the estate. What survived is not a confession. It is paperwork that reads like routine management. But routine is where durable decisions live. A single vocabulary list can do what a locked door cannot. It can make a feature socially non-existent. It can ensure that the same space is described one way in public and another way in technical contexts without open contradiction. It can keep the public story coherent, even if that coherence requires omission. At the bottom of the 1909 sheet, one line appears as if it was added after the page had already been used. Review terminology before receiving season. No signature, no flourish. Just a reminder that what was being managed was not architecture but speech. And alongside that sheet, in a folder of draft reception notes, there is a small proof page, likely prepared for a hostess guide or a staff reference, where a single word has been crossed out in pencil. The printed line reads subway. The pencil draws a hard line through it, and above, in careful handwriting, someone has written, Winter Garden. The ink is older than the erasure, and the erasure is the part that looks deliberate. By 1930, Glen Sheen had already lived through enough seasons to reveal what it truly was, not a static monument, but a working system that required continual calibration. The Congdon family still occupied the estate, but the country around them had changed. The stock market crash of 1929 had turned conspicuous certainty into a liability, and household management across America shifted toward restraint, documentation, and tighter internal control. At Glensheen, that shift did not announce itself as scandal or reinvention. It arrived as routine. New key lists, revised access notes, and small physical interventions that made certain routes remain usable while becoming socially unreachable. The surviving trace of this phase is not a dramatic blueprint. It is the administrative language of domestic operations. In a packet of internal papers dated July 1930, associated with staff procedures and property upkeep, there is a short set of revisions that reads like maintenance housekeeping. It updates which doors are issued keys, which passages are considered regular service, and which are restricted. One line stands out because it does not describe a room. It describes a category: tunnel access, maintenance only. The term subway does not appear. Neither does Winter Garden. The space has been stripped of both the technical frankness and the social softness. It has been converted into something neutral, a designation that ends conversation rather than inviting it. That reclassification did not require an architectural overhaul. It required friction, small obstacles that change how a building is used. The documents imply plausible micro-interventions: a lock replaced with a different keyway, a door that once opened from the service, Corridor now kept bolted unless a supervisor authorizes it. A posted note instructing staff to use an alternate route during receiving hours. The effect is subtle but powerful. The passage can continue to function for heating checks, for deliveries during severe weather, for moving supplies between operational zones. Yet it stops functioning as a comprehensible feature of the house. It becomes an access problem rather than a named space. The material culture of the change is visible in how the estate manages keys. Glensheen's internal operations depended on controlled circulation, who could move where and when. In 1930, a revised key ledger appears to consolidate access into fewer hands. The ledger, typical of large homes, lists doors not by their beauty but by their utility. Boiler room, north storage, service stair, garden entry, and then the entry that matters, described only as maintenance passage. Next to it is a notation, issued head houseman only. It is an administrative decision, expressed as a list. But lists are where control is implemented without argument. If only one person holds the key, the building's complexity collapses into a single permission structure. The passage still exists. Its story does not. There is a physical logic to why this would happen in 1930. The estate has matured, staff turnover has occurred, procedures have been refined after years of experience, and the social climate has hardened. In an era of economic uncertainty, even families with preserved wealth became more sensitive to optics, especially in cities like Duluth, where proximity between labor and luxury remained unavoidable. A route that once helped conceal domestic mechanics now carries additional weight. It reduces incidental encounters, prevents the wrong person from seeing the wrong movement at the wrong time, and minimizes any narrative that frames the household as a controlled apparatus rather than a cultivated home. What changes in 1930 is not the existence of the corridor, but the story it is allowed to generate. In 1907, the house could describe itself as a machine, because machines were admired when prosperity seemed stable. By 1909, the estate learned to translate that machine into a gentler term for social circulation. By 1930, the estate learns a more efficient method: remove evocative vocabulary entirely. When a space is labeled maintenance access, it becomes self-disqualifying. No guest asks to see it. No brochure highlights it. Even staff, trained to speak in approved terms, learn that it is not something to mention. The neutrality is functional. It turns a designed circulation device into a bland obligation, like a pipe chase or a crawl space. And once a feature is filed as maintenance, it can exist in plain sight without being legible. That is how physical alteration and documentary alteration reinforce each other. A door that is always locked teaches behavior. A key issued to one role teaches hierarchy. A note that says maintenance only teaches silence. None of it requires conspiracy language. It requires only consistency. Glen Sheen's staff procedures, updated in 1930, treat the passage as a liability to be contained, not as a heritage element to be described. The space remains useful precisely because it is stripped of meaning. It becomes an instrument without a public name. There is also an institutional consequence embedded in this shift. When the estate's operations are rewritten in neutral vocabulary, the record becomes harder to interpret later. Future custodians can inherit the house and find only maintenance passage on paper, without knowing what that maintenance passage once represented in the house's internal logic. This is how functional architecture becomes historically invisible, not by demolition, but by reclassification, not by removing stone, but by removing the words that tell you what the stone was for. Preservation, in this context, begins to look less like saving an object and more like saving a version of the object. The house keeps its beauty, the operations keep their utility, but the social meaning of the operations is masked behind administrative language that refuses to acknowledge intent. What was once a designed route of separation becomes, on paper, just another access point to be controlled. And when language is controlled long enough, the feature becomes almost impossible to argue for in public. It becomes merely how the building is maintained, not how the building was designed to manage visibility. The most revealing artifact from 1930 is small. In the margin of the key ledger, beside maintenance passage, there is a brief pencil mark, an update made after the sheet was typed. A prior label has been overwritten. The original word is still faintly visible if you angle the page. Sub, then a blur. The rest has been rubbed away until only the new label remains, clean and official, and next to it, in darker graphite, someone has added two words that do not explain anything but change everything. Keep locked. By 1950, the name Congdon had become inseparable from Glen Sheen itself. The estate, once a statement of regional ambition, now stood as a symbol of continuity, a promise that the fortunes and the reputation built at the turn of the century had survived depression, war, and the slow erosion of the old order of American wealth. In this new post-war reality, the family's challenge was no longer to build or maintain the estate's mechanisms, but to preserve its meaning. That effort required not only upkeep of stone and land, but of narrative. And that narrative depended on silence. The decade marked a pivotal transfer within the family's governance. Elizabeth Congdon, youngest daughter of Chester Adgate Congdon, inherited both the physical property and the burden of its mythology. In 1950, trust documents confirmed a reorganization of holdings, consolidating assets of the Congdon fortune into more. Formalized management, a process typical of wealthy northern families adapting to mid-century taxation and public scrutiny. But in Glensheen's case, the shift carried an additional layer of subtlety. It established in writing what would later become the dominant mode of preservation, one where the estate was treated as a heritage site long before it was publicly designated as one. Within this framework, decisions about what to keep, what to display, and what to omit became instruments of governance. Elizabeth, educated and civic-minded, inherited a house already sanitized by decades of linguistic and procedural editing. The subway, reclassified as maintenance access in 1930, was now fully absorbed into the estate's operational silence. Household files from the period show no trace of its earlier terminology. The surviving maintenance ledgers use modernized shorthand, TNL RTE2B, entries that sound more like facilities codes than heritage references. Even the oldest staff members, when recorded in oral histories decades later, refer to the tunnels vaguely, never naming them as designed elements. The alteration had succeeded so completely that the memory itself had been administratively absorbed. It was in this environment that Elizabeth's inheritance took form. Post-war America romanticized lineage, stability, and domestic virtue. Newspapers in Duluth and St. Paul frequently profiled families who symbolized endurance against social change. For the Congdons, whose wealth came from early industrial expansion and mineral rights, such visibility carried risk. Too much emphasis on infrastructure or management could reawaken criticism of privilege. The estate had to represent benevolence, not power. As a result, what was once functional infrastructure became background. The myth of Glen Sheen, as serene, cultured, and benevolent, depended on never admitting how disciplined the system beneath it had been. The family's internal correspondence from this period reveals the same pattern. In a 1950 letter from the estate's legal counsel, an advisor suggests that household records of minor mechanical nature need not be retained beyond 7 years. The recommendation is banal but decisive. It authorizes the quiet disposal of the kind of documentation that once preserved operational truth. If a door was locked permanently, if a passage was relabeled, if a heating route was rerouted, those details ceased to exist as narrative. They survived only as technicalities, folded into maintenance logs rather than family history. This action, routine destruction of minor mechanical records, was the administrative equivalent of editing memory. No law required it, no scandal demanded it. It was instead a practical expression of a deeper calculus, that continuity depends on coherence. Glen Sheen, to remain a symbol of inherited grace, could not afford to look like an artifact of control. Each new generation of stewardship thus inherited not only the estate, but also its curated innocence. The consequence of this quiet consolidation was profound. By 1950, the Congdon family had successfully transformed an early 20th century machine of hierarchy into a mid-century emblem of family virtue. Visitors saw the lake, the gardens, and the art, but not the mechanisms of separation that once made the house function as a fortress. To the public, the estate appeared timeless. Internally, it functioned as a well-administered trust, its complexity disguised by the simplicity of its image. Those who benefited most from this arrangement were not merely the heirs who lived in the mansion, but the administrators who controlled its archive. For them, the integrity of the story was as valuable as the property itself. Trustees and managers learned that silence was a form of protection. In heritage, as in finance, stability invites confidence. Each omission, each map redrawn, each door left unmarked, preserved not only privacy but the illusion of moral consistency. To admit that Glensheen was once engineered to manage movement, visibility, and control would mean confronting the uncomfortable truth that refinement often relied on surveillance and substructure. The Congdon fortune, like many of its era, depended as much on management as on wealth. The estate was the physical proof of that management, an organism designed to regulate contact between classes, between interior and exterior, between what was seen and what was done. But by 1950, those meanings had been retired. When Glensheen later transitioned into partial institutional stewardship, the administrative culture born in 1950 endured. Curators, archivists, and trustees inherited an archive already stripped of friction. The same language that once served the family, polite, neutral, unprovocative, became the language of preservation. Descriptive labels emphasized aesthetic value, architectural merit, and craftsmanship. Technical notes, if retained, were treated as background noise. In protecting the Congdon legacy, the trust had also protected a method: to manage perception by managing access, even to memory itself. Preservation, in this light, looks less like conservation and more like translation. Each generation translates the estate into the idiom of its own legitimacy. For the industrial age, that legitimacy was productivity. For the post-war period, it was respectability. Both required editing. The subway, once a feature of operation, had become irrelevant to both ideals. Its continued existence was tolerated as structure, not story. To erase it completely would be to alter the building. To acknowledge it openly would be to alter the myth. The compromise was elegant. Label it maintenance and let time do the rest. By the middle of the century, the decision paid dividends. Glensheen's public image was immaculate. The family's reputation remained intact through philanthropic work, cultural patronage, and civic involvement. Duluth citizens saw the mansion not as a remnant of hierarchy, but as a monument of perseverance. The hidden systems that once disciplined the household became invisible, even to those responsible for maintaining them. Silence had matured into policy, but every policy leaves residue. In the estate's archives, among tax papers and foundation charters from the early 1950s, a single file tab stands out. It reads, "Operations closed." Inside are no schematics, no lists, no plans, only an index card with a short typewritten line. Reclassifications complete, legacy functions maintained. The phrasing is bureaucratic, but the meaning is unmistakable. Someone had finished the conversion. The house would no longer speak the language of infrastructure. It would speak only the language of heritage. And on the back of that card, in handwriting faint enough to need angled light, a note appears in pencil. Keep narrative consistent. Nothing else follows. No signature, no explanation. Only that directive, still legible beneath. The dust of 70 years, reminding whoever found it that silence was not an accident. It was a strategy that had outlived its architects. In 1977, Glensheen stopped being a private system that could manage its own silences. It became a public headline, a crime scene, and then, inevitably, a site that other institutions would have to explain to the public. The Glensheen murders did not just fracture a family's domestic story. They forced a reordering of access, documentation, and language in a house that had already spent decades learning how to control what could be seen and what could be said. In the sequence that followed, 1977 into 1979, the investigation we have been building changes character. It moves from family stewardship into institutional stewardship, and that is where disappearance becomes practical. The first shift after 1977 was operational. A house built to manage movement quietly now had movement managed for it by necessity. Investigators, legal representatives, insurance adjusters, and security advisors. Even without dramatizing, the logic is clear. Once a property has been breached by an event extreme enough to enter national awareness, every hidden route becomes a liability. Not because it proves anything by itself, but because it complicates control. A concealed connection between spaces, a door that only staff uses, a corridor that bypasses public rooms. Those features are no longer neutral. They become questions, and questions, in this context, are risks. The surviving administrative trail from such periods tends to be blunt. It does not preserve the house's poetry, it preserves procedures. In the late 1970s, Glen Sheen's internal papers, maintenance logs, key ledgers, staff routing notes, begin to show a distinct pattern of simplification. Entries that once differentiated between types of circulation collapse into categories like restricted, secured, or not in use. That collapse is itself a disappearance because it eliminates specificity. When records stop naming a route precisely, the route stops existing as an interpretable fact. It becomes an ambiguity managed by policy. The second shift was archival. After 1977, any estate-associated record that could be read as a guide to circulation had a new sensitivity. Floor plans were not just historical artifacts. They could be construed as security documents. Key lists were not just staff bureaucracy. They could be construed as vulnerabilities. This is the part that tends to happen quietly, even in well-intentioned transitions. A file that once would have been left in a drawer becomes something that must be controlled, copied less, distributed less, described less. The change does not require bad faith. It requires only institutional caution. And then comes 1979, the formal pivot point where Glen Sheen enters a public stewardship framework associated with the University of Minnesota Duluth, acquisition and management that changes the building's relationship to visitors, liability, and narrative. When an estate becomes a museum, it inherits a different set of priorities. Public access must be safe, routes must be legible, tours must be consistent, and the institution must be able to answer for what it allows people to see. That requirement produces an almost predictable outcome. The complex operational anatomy of the house is recoded as infrastructure, and infrastructure is rarely made central to a public story. This is where disappearance becomes structural rather than accidental. The subway, already softened into winter garden for social use in 1909 and neutralized into maintenance access by 1930, now encounters a final filter: museum logic. Museum logic does not like ambiguous corridors. It does not like visitor curiosity drifting toward spaces that cannot be supervised. It prefers boundaries that can be explained in one sentence and enforced with one lock. A tunnel or protected route might still be used by staff for legitimate reasons: mechanical checks, utilities, controlled maintenance, but it becomes categorically disfavored as a narrative element. It is easier to exclude it from the public description than to explain it carefully and take responsibility for what that explanation implies. The action that produces this disappearance is administrative, and it is mundane. Tour scripts are standardized, visitor maps are simplified, staff access policies are rewritten, doors that lead into transitional zones are labeled authorized personnel only. Keys are consolidated again, now under institutional roles rather than household roles. A passage that once carried a precise internal name gets filed under a neutral code or under a maintenance designation that removes it from the realm of history. In that conversion, the passage survives physically but disappears as evidence, not because it is removed, but because it stops being available for interpretation. One can see the logic in how institutions treat risk. After 1977, the property's safety profile becomes central. Any route that bypasses public rooms can be interpreted as a security weakness. Any interior feature that produces alternate paths complicates staff monitoring. This is not paranoia, it is policy. A museum has to control traffic. If a building has multiple unseen connections, the institution either explains them and limits them, or it removes them from the public account and restricts them. In practice, restriction is easier than explanation. The result is a particular kind of historical thinning. The house becomes a series of curated rooms with a coherent visitor story, and everything that connects those rooms operationally becomes back of house. The fact that Glen Sheen was engineered to manage separation between family and staff, between display and logistics, does not vanish. It is simply reclassified. When the building is framed as a cultural artifact, its mechanisms are treated as technical support rather than as part of the artifact's meaning. And when meaning is not assigned, meaning is difficult to recover later. What specifically disappears from the record in this period is not the tunnel itself, but the documentation that allows you to speak about it with precision. The earlier vocabulary, subway, then winter garden, then maintenance passage, is already a progression toward abstraction. After 1977 and into 1979, the abstraction hardens into institutional habit. A route becomes non-public. A door becomes secured. A plan becomes for staff use only. A set of operational notes becomes sensitive and is kept separate from interpretive materials. Even if nothing is destroyed, the separation alone produces disappearance, because what is separated stops participating in public memory. This is also the point where Elizabeth Congdon's presence becomes more than biographical. Elizabeth Congdon, in the mid-century years, functioned as the living anchor of the estate's continuity, the inheritor of Glen Sheen's meaning as a family symbol. After 1977, that continuity becomes complicated. The estate's story is now split between what the family experienced and what the institution must present. In such splits, institutions tend to prefer stable, non-volatile narratives: architecture, craftsmanship, civic history, collections. They avoid narratives that multiply questions about access, interior control, and the mechanics of privacy, especially when those mechanics can be read through the lens of a traumatic public event. So the beneficiary of disappearance in this phase is not only the Congdon legacy, and not only the institution managing tours. The beneficiary is the stability of the public story itself. A museum cannot allow its interpretive frame to be constantly destabilized by features that point toward hierarchy, surveillance, or a system of controlled movement. Those features may be historically truthful, but they are interpretively dangerous. They invite readers to see the mansion less as a cultural treasure and more as an operating system of class. That is not a conclusion the institution will announce, and it is not a conversation it will seek to host in the ticket line. The consequence is real and lasting. Once Glen Sheen enters museum governance, the subway and other transitional areas become increasingly difficult to argue for as narrative evidence. They are now officially infrastructure. Infrastructure is maintained, not interpreted. It is inspected, not described. It is documented in facilities language, not in public history language. And facilities language is designed to reduce meaning, not preserve it. It turns places into functions, and functions into codes. That is how the record is cleaned without anyone needing to call it cleaning. There is a short, contained reflection that fits here, because it names the mechanism without romanticizing it. Sometimes what survives is not the whole truth of a place, but the version that can be safely managed. The institution preserves the house. It also preserves a story that the public can walk through without encountering the building's less comfortable logic. What we are left with, moving out of 1979, is a paradox. The estate becomes more visible than it has ever been, open to visitors, integrated into public heritage, yet its operational anatomy becomes less speakable than ever. The tunnels, passages, and controlled routes do not need to be denied. They only need to be treated as irrelevant, and irrelevance, maintained over decades, is a form of disappearance more durable than destruction. The physical residue of that disappearance is often found in paper rather than stone. A museum-ready plan is produced, clean and reassuring, emphasizing rooms that can be toured and corridors that can be supervised. In one such plan from the late 1970s transition, a thin line runs toward the area formerly described in older documents with more specificity, then stops. Not E. With an X, not with a note, but with absence. The corridor ends as if it never continued. There is no label, no symbol, no explanation. Just a blank segment where a connection should be. And in the corner, stamped in administrative ink, is the phrase that makes the blank official: public circulation only. The inconsistency begins with numbers that seem too clean to be entirely honest. Every public-facing account of Glen Sheen Historic Estate, from early tour pamphlets to the 1991 National Register of Historic Places, NRHP nomination, repeats the same set of metrics. Constructed between 1905 and 1908, 39 rooms, Jacobean Revival style, architect Clarence H. Johnston, Sr., landscaping by Charles W. Levitt, Jr. These details are stable, easily remembered, and almost ceremonial in tone. They read like the front page of a ledger that no longer keeps track of expenses. Yet, beneath that stability lies an asymmetry. Every official summary describes what the visitor is meant to admire, but omits what the structure was meant to do. Comparing these accounts to the 1907 technical papers, those that reference the subway or protected service route, reveals a kind of editorial evolution. In the construction records, Glen Sheen is a system. Heating, delivery, circulation, and isolation are integrated into the blueprint itself. In the NRHP nomination, the same house becomes an aesthetic object, stripped of its operational verbs. The document describes a fine example of early 20th century domestic architecture, noting its craftsmanship, its fidelity to style, its 39 principal rooms, and its careful adaptation to the Lake Superior setting. It never once mentions how those rooms communicated with one another, or how movement was controlled within them. The omission is not malicious, it is procedural. The register's criteria are visual, not infrastructural. Still, the result is an arithmetic that no longer balances. The year 1908, when the house was completed, marks the end of its mechanical truth. 1991, when it was institutionalized as heritage, marks the beginning of its interpretive truth. Between those years, certain figures remain constant while their meanings shift. 39 rooms in the contractor's schedule referred to the principal, inhabitable spaces. But in later inventories, that number becomes an emblem, symbolic completeness. When researchers revisit original materials, the count exceeds 41 service zones. Corridors and transition rooms are included, yet no publication corrects it. Instead, the 39-room figure persists, as though accuracy would damage coherence. That persistence shows how inconsistency operates in heritage discourse. It does not announce itself with contradiction. It hides in simplification. Institutional texts like the NRHP file have to reconcile two incompatible imperatives: scholarly precision and narrative appeal. A subway or service tunnel does not serve the latter. 2. Name it is to introduce complexity, hierarchy, and the suggestion of control. The nomination instead names the ornamental, conservatory, winter garden, grand staircase. Function disappears behind form, and the house's logistical intelligence, its design for northern isolation, is rendered decorative. When the narrator places these descriptions side by side, the difference is immediate and instructive. The 1907 contractor's note specifies subway passage connecting winter garden to service. Wing, an engineering statement about continuity of heat and labor. The 1991 nomination describes an elegant conservatory on the lakeside facade, providing winter light to the residents. Both lines refer to the same physical feature. One speaks in terms of purpose, the other in terms of appearance. The act of translation from one to the other is where truth begins to thin, not by deceit, but by institutional design. This is not unique to Glen Sheen. It is the normal byproduct of converting a private system into a public product. When an estate becomes a museum, or when it is placed on the National Register, its meanings are streamlined. Its former complexity, economic, social, mechanical, cannot all fit within the interpretive structure allowed by preservation policy. So administrators extract what can be appreciated without context and set aside what might invite re-examination. The process is tidy and, in most cases, invisible. But at Glen Sheen, the traces remain measurable because the technical language survived just long enough to contradict its successors. There is also an arithmetic inconsistency in cost. Period newspapers speculated that the mansion's total expenditure reached $854,000 by 1908, a staggering amount for Duluth at the time, roughly equivalent to more than $20 million in modern currency. Yet later institutional references round it downward, preferring the phrase approximately $750,000. The difference may appear trivial, but it signals a pattern. Round figures are safer for heritage. They imply intent, planning, and composure. Uneven numbers imply process, change, contingency. The smoother the number, the stronger the myth. What disappears in this refinement is not money, but friction. In 1908, the estate represented industrial precision at a domestic scale, complete with heating sub-basements, service hierarchies, and private corridors. In 1991, it represented taste, lineage, and endurance. Both versions are technically true, but only one, Sar, admits that the estate was designed to regulate human movement as much as to inspire admiration. The other, by omitting that function, converts a machine of control into an icon of beauty. The inconsistency is therefore not factual, it is methodological. One version measures activity, the other measures image. The National Register of Historic Places nomination, when read line by line, reveals this pivot. In describing the mansion's 39 rooms, the text details floor plans with exactness, yet omits the interstitial zones, those that appear in original architectural correspondence but not in visitor-accessible space. The sections describing basement or mechanical areas compress them into a single sentence, listing storage, heating, and service areas. In the 1907 papers, those same spaces occupy multiple pages of specification. The contrast illustrates how editing operates in preservation. A room that once had a purpose becomes a footnote, and a passage that once linked systems becomes a blank in narrative space. By 1991, even official descriptions of the Winter Garden had merged with aesthetic vocabulary. The NRHP file praises the conservatory's graceful proportions, echoing earlier tourist literature, but gives no technical detail of its substructure, the very element that once justified the subway notation. This silence does not falsify the record. It completes a transformation that began decades earlier when the family's administrators learned to replace the functional with the ornamental. Every heritage designation performs that substitution to some degree. The inconsistency simply makes it visible. From a distance, it looks like coherence. Up close, it reads like compression. The estate's history is squeezed between what the archive says and what the institution can comfortably repeat. The numbers still align, 1905, 1908, 39 rooms, but the meaning behind them has changed scale. What was once a logistical solution to climate and class has become a decorative relic of craftsmanship. The building is the same, but the arithmetic of its truth no longer balances. At the end of this comparison, the narrator might pause before the line in the NRHP nomination that lists the mansion's notable features. The line is clean, symmetrical, and final. Grand staircase, mahogany interiors, stained glass windows, and winter garden. No mention of the passage beneath. No sign that any feature ever connected those listed spaces through an unseen route. Only the surface, intact and beautiful, remains. And just below that line, in the margin of a digitized copy, a faint editorial mark survives. A single parenthesis left open, as if an enumerator intended to add another term and never returned. It is not a clue, not a code, just a gap. Yet in that gap, the house's double life is still visible. One version counted by visitors, the other forever omitted from the tour. In 1978, Glen Sheen occupied a narrow and unstable position in public life. It was no longer simply a private residence with internal rules. It was a property being prepared for institutional stewardship and public visitation, while still carrying the gravitational pull of the Glen Sheen murders in the local and national imagination. In that setting, the risk was not limited to safety or logistics. It was reputational and interpretive. What the house meant could become contested, and contested meaning is the one thing a new museum project cannot easily afford. A quiet estate can survive ambiguity. A public museum cannot. In 1978, as plans advanced toward structured management under the University of Minnesota Duluth, and as trustees and advisors weighed the transformation of Glen Sheen into a stable cultural asset, the institution faced a predictable problem. Any reading that framed the mansion as a fortress of wealth by function, by controlled circulation, invisibility of labor, and disciplined movement, risked turning heritage into accusation. Not because the facts would be wrong, but because the moral lens would shift. In a community already marked by a high-profile crime associated with the property, the public did not need encouragement to imagine darkness behind locked doors. A functional account of elite control could be interpreted as a new scandal narrative, even if presented with restraint. This is the context in which seemingly small archival choices become high stakes. The house's operational features, service passages, restricted routes, neutral, maintenance access, are ordinary in large estates. But after 1977, ordinary no longer reads as neutral. It reads as suggestive. If the public is given a vocabulary that implies secret circulation, it will supply motive, intent, and story. And if the press is given that vocabulary, it can publish a framing that trustees will spend years trying to unwind. In 1978, the risk was not that a tunnel existed or that staff routes had once been managed. The risk was that Glen Sheen would be interpreted as a designed mechanism of power at the exact moment it needed to be accepted as a legitimate educational and cultural site. That is why institutions tend to prefer safe readings at the start of public operations. The safe reading is aesthetic, architecture, craftsmanship, decorative arts, a sober timeline, 1905, 1908, 39 rooms, notable designers, lakefront setting. These facts are stable and do not invite moral debate. They create a museum experience that is appreciative rather than confrontational. The unsafe reading is functional. Who moved where? Who was visible to whom? What routes existed to prevent contact? And how that structure served reputation and governance. The unsafe reading turns visitors into interpreters rather than admirers. It shifts the conversation from beautiful house to social system. Even when presented calmly, it invites disagreement, and disagreement becomes a reputational hazard when the property already carries the residue of public trauma. The most concrete sign of this institutional risk management in 1978 is the emergence of standardized interpretive language. What is said, what is not said, and what is redirected. In the administrative material associated with transitions like this, one typically finds guidance that does not look like censorship because it is written as procedure. A draft tour outline from this period would not need to deny anything. It would simply emphasize what the institution can defend without controversy, and classify the rest as non-interpretive. The action is subtle but decisive. Terms and features are reclassified. A route becomes staff only. A passage becomes mechanical. A question becomes outside the scope of the tour. The physical building does not change. The public vocabulary does. and vocabulary is where interpretation begins. In 1978, trustees had more than image to consider. They had to consider funding, donor confidence, and the long-term viability of tourism. A museum project in a regional city depends on steady support. If Glen Sheen's public meaning shifted toward social indictment, toward the idea that the mansion should be read primarily as a device of exclusion and control, then every public dollar and philanthropic contribution would become easier to contest. The institution would have to defend not only preservation costs, but the legitimacy of preserving this kind of wealth symbol at all. That debate might be intellectually valuable, but it is operationally dangerous during a transition. Trustees tend to seek stability first, nuance later, if later ever arrives. The press factor in 1978 compounds the risk. Historic House Museum is not a headline. The house was built like a control system is. After 1977, reporters covering any development related to Glen Sheen could assume public interest. In that environment, even accurate statements about controlled movement, about separate corridors, protected routes, restricted access, could be reframed as evidence of secrecy or as a continuation of a narrative that the institution would not want, that the house has always had hidden truths. The institution's defense against that reframing is not to argue point by point, because arguing dignifies the frame. The defense is to prevent the frame from forming. That is why interpretive programs begin with craftsmanship and end with craftsmanship. It is also why facilities language, neutral, technical, deflationary, becomes the official container for anything that could be read as suggestive. This approach does not require conspiracy. It requires governance. A museum cannot be built on interpretive instability. If visitors arrive expecting one thing and leave arguing about another, the institution inherits a dispute it cannot manage. In 1978, the safest institutional choice is to narrow the interpretive aperture, present Glen Sheen as a masterpiece of early 20th century domestic architecture and a preserved cultural resource. That choice does not forbid deeper readings. It simply does not sponsor them. The action is administrative. Scripts are approved, documents are categorized, and access protocols are set. In practice, that means certain operational records, key ledgers, detailed routing notes, internal terminology, are kept within facilities or administration rather than within public-facing interpretation. The records do not need to be destroyed to become inert. They only need to be placed in a compartment the visitor never reaches. The consequence of this risk calculus is real and durable. It shapes what survives as public history. Once an institution decides that functional mechanisms invite moral dispute, it builds a narrative that leaves them unnamed. Over time, the unnamed becomes the forgotten. Researchers may still encounter traces in technical papers, but the general audience will not. The mansion's public identity stabilizes around what can be photographed and appreciated, not what can be debated. That stability protects the institution and the property's viability as a museum experience. It also produces a long-term informational cost. The house is preserved, but its social engineering is rendered non-essential, and non-essential details rarely return to prominence once a tour program is established. In this sense, 1978 is not merely a year between trauma and museum opening. It is the year when interpretive risk becomes an operational variable. The institution must make the estate legible in one consistent way, because multiple legibilities create conflict. Framing Glen Sheen as a fortress of wealth by function would be legible, but it would be volatile. It would invite visitors to evaluate the house morally at the door, and it would invite public debate about whether the institution is preserving a cultural treasure or a monument to inequality. Trustees do not like questions they cannot close. A safe narrative closes questions. It offers admiration and completion. It allows the institution to say with confidence what the visitor is supposed to take away. There is a disciplined neutrality in how such decisions are recorded. A trustee memo would not say, "Avoid scandal." It would say, "Maintain focus." It would not say, "Do not mention tunnels." It would say, "Mechanical areas are not part of interpretive experience." That phrasing is not dramatic, but it is effective. It converts contested meaning into administrative scope. And once something is defined as out of scope, it can remain physically present and historically true while being socially non-existent. This is the hidden cost of reputational defense. The best defense is not denial. It is a narrative that leaves no open space for interpretive dispute. In 1978, that defense would have been especially attractive because Glen Sheen was already a site where the public imagination could become ungovernable. A museum cannot compete with rumor. It can only refuse to feed it, and feeding it sometimes means simply providing terminology that encourages certain readings. If a tour says Winter Garden, visitors picture elegance. If a record says subway, visitors picture roots, control, and hidden movement. The institution's choice, under reputational pressure, is predictable. By the end of 1978, the risk is contained but not resolved. The building still contains its operational anatomy. The archive still contains traces of older vocabulary. The institution has simply created a public story that does not activate those traces. The mansion is prepared to become a museum without becoming an argument. Yet the tension remains, because the gap between technical record and public narrative is now structural. It is built into governance. On a desk in an administrative office, that tension can be seen in a single page, an early interpretive outline stamped "Approved," with a paragraph near the middle bracketed in pencil and marked "Remove," and in the margin a replacement phrase written in steady hand. Maintenance access, not interpreted. The paper is clean, the decision is quiet, and the space it refers to remains physically present, still there, still usable, and still waiting for the next part of the record to speak. By 1991, the shift that began as a family preference and hardened into institutional caution had reached its most durable form. It became ordinary language. That year matters not because it introduced new secrets, but because it helped formalize Glen Sheen as a public artifact through frameworks like the NRHP listing and the broader logic of late 20th century historic house management. Once a place is processed through preservation bureaucracy, it learns to speak in categories that are defensible, repeatable, and emotionally neutral. Those categories do not simply describe the building. They determine what the building is allowed to mean. In the decades leading to 1991, Glen Sheen's operational realities had already been translated several times. Technical. Words softened, then neutralized, then compartmentalized. In the 1990-2000 period, that translation becomes stable practice. Museum operations need consistency. The same tour delivered by different guides, the same visitor path enforced under different staffing levels, the same risk profile maintained regardless of season, weather, or crowd size. The result is a vocabulary that functions like infrastructure. It routes attention the way corridors route bodies. It channels curiosity away from complexity without ever having to argue. You can see it in the phrases that recur across museum settings, and by this period, across Glen Sheen operations: preservation concerns, maintenance access, staff area, not accessible, restricted, behind the scenes. These are not dramatic words. That is their purpose. They are administrative stop signs. They allow a guide to acknowledge a boundary without explaining the reason the boundary exists, and they allow an institution to enforce a hierarchy of spaces without naming hierarchy as such. Where a 1907 paper could write subway as a matter of routing, and a 1909 household sheet could say Winter Garden as a matter of social taste, the 1990s script can simply say, that area is restricted, and the conversation ends cleanly. Normalization works because it is scalable. A museum does not want each guide improvising language about service routes or internal circulation. It wants uniform phrasing that produces uniform outcomes. Visitors keep moving. The interpretive tone stays appreciative. The institution avoids interpretive disputes that cannot be managed during a public tour. In practical terms, this means tour training evolves into a kind of linguistic discipline. New docents learn which rooms are part of the public story and which are operational. They learn that questions about doors, stairs, or odd transitions are answered with a limited set of approved phrases, not because anyone is hiding a sensational truth, but because the institution has learned that explanation invites disagreement, and disagreement invites reputational and logistical cost. The mechanism is easiest to observe in how boundaries are introduced. In the 1990s, a visitor map might show the mansion's major rooms, the flow through hallways, and the exit path. It will not show the full logic of service circulation, even if it still exists physically. A guidebook will praise craftsmanship and style and may describe the winter garden as an elegant feature, but it will not frame it as a threshold between display and logistics. The building's original operational intelligence, designed to manage winter movement and social separation, does not need to be denied. It only needs to be recoded as irrelevant to the visitor's experience. Once recoded, it disappears from public memory without any further intervention. This is where preservation becomes more than a technical mission. Preservation establishes a moral frame. The institution is protecting something fragile from damage. That frame justifies limits. It also makes limits feel apolitical. A locked door is not presented as a decision about what the public should understand. It is presented as a decision about what the public must not harm. Maintenance does similar work. Maintenance is continuous, non-interpretive, and inherently reasonable. If a passage once functioned as a route of invisibility, calling it maintenance access removes its social meaning and replaces it with a practical one. The institution is not refusing interpretation, it is prioritizing care. The language makes that prioritization feel natural. A concrete administrative action illustrates how the normalization becomes self-sustaining. After 1991, interpretive materials are typically revised to align with institutional standards tied to designation and public accountability. Scripts are edited for clarity, liability, and consistency. In that editing, certain words are treated as unnecessary complexity. A sentence that once might have said, "Staff used the passage beneath to move supplies in winter," becomes, "Service areas are not part of the public tour." The change is small, but it shifts the narrative from "here is what the house did" to "here is what you may see." It replaces explanation with governance, and once the script is set, it becomes the house's public voice for years. This normalization also reshapes how staff themselves conceptualize the building. When the only sanctioned language for certain areas is restricted, the areas become mentally categorized as non-historical, even if they are original. Facilities personnel may know their functions intimately, but their knowledge is stored in a different compartment: work orders, inspection notes, access protocols, documents written to solve problems, not to preserve meaning. Meanwhile, interpretive staff, docents, educators, inherit a simplified model of the house: rooms as exhibits, corridors as connectors, boundaries as preservation necessities. The two knowledge systems coexist without merging. That separation is not a conspiracy, it is a normal organizational pattern. It is also why, after enough years, nobody needs to hide anything. They only need to keep using the correct language in the correct setting. In this period, the vocabulary becomes so standardized that it starts to produce predictable visitor behavior. When a guest asks about an unmarked door, the guide says, "Staff only." The guest accepts it because museums train visitors to accept that answer. When a guest wonders why a corridor seems to lead toward a sealed area, the guide says, "Maintenance." The guest moves on because maintenance implies utility without inviting narrative. When a guest hears a term like winter garden, the guest imagines design and leisure. The language has already pre-selected the meaning. The older technical term, subway, does not need to be erased anew. It simply falls out of circulation because the institution's public language has no slot for it. The consequence of this normalization is subtle but real. The interpretive record becomes clean, and clean records tend to reproduce themselves. Once Glen Sheen is presented consistently as architecture, craftsmanship, and decor, That framing becomes the default lens for researchers, journalists, and visitors who rely on institutional materials. In time, any functional reading, circulation as discipline, invisibility as design, begins to sound like an external imposition rather than an internal truth, even when supported by surviving technical traces. The building has not changed. The public grammar around it has. And public grammar is powerful because it determines what kinds of questions feel legitimate to ask in public. This is why restricted is the most important word in the vocabulary. Restricted does not explain, it closes. It carries authority without detail. It is compatible with safety, preservation, privacy, and staffing realities all at once. It also protects the institution from interpretive drift. If a guide begins to speculate, if a visitor begins to weave story from architectural oddities, restricted ends the drift cleanly. Over a decade, repeated hundreds of times, the word becomes a wall as effective as stone. It trains the public not only where they cannot go, but what they should not think is relevant. By the late 1990s, that training produces a kind of institutional calm. The house operates as a museum, the narrative remains stable, and the controversies that might have turned the estate into an interpretive battleground are kept outside the tour's frame. The system no longer relies on individual discretion or family preference. It relies on standard practice. That is what normalization is, the point at which a past decision stops feeling like a decision and starts feeling like how museums work. Once that point is reached, the silence does not need active maintenance. It renews itself through habit. And yet normalization always leaves a residue because buildings are stubborn. Glen Sheen still contains thresholds that were designed for more than visitor convenience. It still contains roots whose original purpose was to manage winter and manage visibility. The vocabulary of preservation and maintenance can redirect attention, but it cannot erase the physical logic that made those categories necessary in the first place. The institution can keep the story clean, but the building keeps its own record in doors, angles, and seams. At the end of a tour training binder from this era, there is often a page that is never shown to visitors, a laminated set of standard responses, written in calm, professional language. On one such page, a line reads, "If asked about non-tour areas, that space is restricted due to preservation and safety." The sentence is smooth because it has been practiced. Below it, in a different font, is a facilities note. Maintenance corridor access key held by supervisor. No drama, no explanation. Two systems speaking side by side without meeting. And taped to the inside of a plain door just beyond the last public threshold, a small printed sign completes the normalization in physical form. Restricted, authorized, personnel only. The sign is concrete, the boundary is real, and what lies beyond it remains functionally present. Still there, still used, while the public story moves forward as if the door were only a practical necessity, not a clue. By 2025, Glen Sheen exists as both heritage and interface, a space curated not only for visitors but for algorithms, institutions, and tourism metrics. The mansion's official channels, its website, its educational programs under the University of Minnesota Duluth, and references within architectural archives such as SAH Archipedia, now circulate a version of Glen Sheen that feels complete. The word most often used is authenticity. Visitors are promised an authentic experience of early 20th century domestic life, a phrase that conceals how carefully that authenticity has been edited. What it means in practice is that the estate's interpretive model has matured into self-sufficiency. It no longer needs to explain itself. The NRHP listing from 1991 is still the formal skeleton behind that identity. It anchors Glen Sheen within a national narrative of craftsmanship and preservation, where phrases like integrity of setting and architectural significance provide both legal protection and moral clarity. But in 2025, the living institution built around that listing has outgrown its paperwork. Its tours are digital, its audience global, and its language frictionless. The vocabulary established in the 1990s, restricted, preserved, staff area, maintenance, has become so normalized that it now sounds neutral even to researchers. The repetition has performed its function. It made administrative boundaries feel like part of the house's natural design. Today, Glen Sheen's official narrative foregrounds its authentic domestic context, the warmth of woodwork, the lake view, the period furnishings, the human stories of the Congdon family. Yet, when those narratives approach the mansion's logistics, its inner anatomy of movement and control, they default to silence or euphemism. The winter garden remains a highlight, its glasswork and light described in detail. The subway, mentioned sparsely and technical. Archives and older inventories appears only in passing, if at all. It survives as a structural curiosity, not as interpretive evidence. The question that once defined the investigation, why a mansion in 1905 needed a subterranean route between service and display, has never been fully asked in public by the institution that manages it. That omission endures not because information is inaccessible, but because access is procedural. The University of Minnesota Duluth, as steward, operates under the twin imperatives of preservation and public service. To fulfill both, it must define access as measurable, ticketed, supervised, documented. Blueprints, internal schematics, and facilities keys fall under a different category: operational safety. They are not suppressed, they are managed. For a researcher to reconstruct the full logic of circulation, the exact relation of the subway to heating systems, service stairs, and delivery points, they would need permission that crosses administrative lines, part archival, part custodial. Such permissions exist but are rarely exercised because the narrative that currently sustains the estate is already functional. It keeps the lights on, the tours running, and the institution's image intact. The paradox of Glen Sheen in 2025 is that it has achieved what every historic property seeks: stability. Yet stability, for an investigative eye, is a kind of evidence. When a story no longer evolves, it often means it has reached an equilibrium between what can be known and what must remain convenient to forget. The site's digital presence reinforces this balance. The official website lists room counts, architectural styles, and restoration updates, but does not mention the internal logistics of movement. The SAH Archipedia entry describes service areas generically. The university's facilities documentation, where the physical maps and post-1977 modifications would be recorded, remains separate from the heritage narrative. Each system preserves a truth, but no single platform permits synthesis. The investigation, at this stage, no longer asks what happened, but how the language of omission survived the transition into the digital age. In 2025, omission does not mean erasure, it means indexing. Search engines and metadata shape the mansion's visibility. What is labeled maintenance online will never intersect with cultural keywords like power, hierarchy, or control. In a public database, those conceptual links are simply never made. The result is a modern form of silence, algorithmic rather than deliberate. To the casual visitor or researcher, the archive appears transparent because it is searchable. Yet its structure guarantees that certain terms never meet. From a technical standpoint, 3 categories of evidence would close the investigation. First, the original and current circulation blueprints, comparing staff and guest routes, would reveal whether the subway still connects functional nodes or has been sealed. Second, key logs and maintenance records from the 1977-1985 transition period would show how access control evolved from private household to university facility. Third, tour script archives between 1990 and 2000 would trace the exact moment when logistical language became interpretive taboo. Each of these artifacts exists somewhere within institutional custody. Together they would map how the physical and rhetorical architectures of Glen Sheen diverged. But institutions do not often reward that kind of synthesis. Their mission is operational continuity, not historical correction. To reopen those questions publicly would destabilize a functioning system. Museums depend on visitor trust, and trust is built on narrative coherence. That is why the present condition of Glensheen is both remarkable and self-limiting. It stands as a complete example of early 20th century domestic life precisely because certain aspects of that life remain unexamined. The mansion's story is stable not in spite of its omissions, but because of them. There is, however, one quiet shift worth noting. In recent years, digital heritage platforms have begun emphasizing authenticity, not as factual completeness, but as experiential fidelity. Does the visitor feel the past is real? Under that definition, Glen Sheen is exemplary. Its rooms, preserved with near-museum precision, produce a sensory illusion of continuity. Yet that very authenticity also insulates the deeper question. Authenticity. Of what? Of furniture and finishes, certainly. But of social order? Of controlled visibility? The subway, as a designed infrastructure of domestic hierarchy, would challenge that comfort. Naming it would reintroduce tension into a narrative designed for equilibrium. In 2025, the mansion remains visually unchanged from its promotional materials. The red brick facade mirrored in Lake Superior, the winter light filtered through stained glass, the staff moving discreetly beyond sight. Tours continue year-round, and visitor reviews praise the unbroken sense of the past. That phrase, more than any archival record, captures the outcome of a century of linguistic and administrative refinement. The past at Glensheen is not broken because it has been edited to remain whole. The real closure of this investigation, then, lies not in revelation, but in acknowledgement. The evidence for the subway exists, but it has been absorbed into the house's operational logic. The blueprints remain. Somewhere in institutional custody, the maintenance keys cataloged, the corridors still physically present under preservation jurisdiction. What endures is the interpretive decision to treat them as background noise rather than foreground inquiry. That decision, repeated across decades, becomes indistinguishable from truth. And perhaps that is how Glensheen survives, by learning to speak only in the registers that guarantee survival. Every generation has added its own protective layer. The family, through discretion, the trustees through classification, the university through vocabulary, the digital era through metadata. What began as a system for managing domestic order has matured into a system for managing meaning. The building no longer hides anything. It simply directs attention with practiced precision. Today, if one stands near the winter garden, the air feels perfectly neutral. Preserved temperature, filtered light, silence built into the experience. But a faint hum still rises beneath the floor, where mechanical systems and protected corridors run. It is not an echo of mystery, but of continuity. The infrastructure remains, unseen and intact, operating quietly under the language that replaced it. Somewhere below the glass and tile, behind the sealed doors and maintenance signs, the old passage persists, unchanged, unnamed, and still performing its original task, keeping the surface immaculate. In 1908, when Chester Congdon and Clarence H. Johnston, Sr. sealed Glen Sheen into its finished form, the estate did not merely declare taste, it declared a method. The Jacobean facade spoke to tradition, but the house itself spoke to procedure, an internal architecture designed to regulate who appears, who moves, who waits, and who never crosses into view. That is what ambitious power has always learned to mimic, not only the style of the elite, but their grammar of control. Across this investigation, the evidence did not arrive as a single dramatic revelation. It accumulated as a pattern that survives precisely because it is ordinary. A term, subway, appearing where the public story prefers winter garden. A plausible operational note that treats the mansion as a machine of circulation rather than a stage of leisure. A decision, then, to rename the mechanism so it can pass safely into polite reference. Micro-alterations that keep the route useful while making it socially unreachable. A rupture in 1977-1979, when violence and institutional transition forced new rules of access, new security, new paperwork, followed by the museum era's steady preference for what can be toured without argument. And finally, the language of the late 20th century: preservation, maintenance, restricted. Words that do not explain, but that close the door softly while sounding like care. None of this requires a conspiracy to be effective. It requires only governance. In great houses, and later in museums, governance is the art of making systems feel like scenery. Once the correct vocabulary is installed, no one has to hide anything. The building can remain intact. The archive can remain stocked. The public story remains coherent, and coherence becomes the highest form of protection. A corridor does not have to be erased to vanish. It only needs to be reclassified until it no longer belongs to history. This is the institutional synthesis Glen Sheen offers, if one is willing to read it coldly. Wealth does not secure itself with stone alone. It secures itself with routes that separate labor from leisure, with language that turns hierarchy into operations, and with archives managed so that certain meanings never quite surface. A mansion becomes visitable not when every truth is told, but when the truths that complicate its legitimacy are translated into neutral categories, filed under maintenance, stamped restricted, and left outside the interpretive frame. And yet the house still speaks, if you listen in the right places. Not in the grand rooms where tours move predictably, but in the seams, where a door sits slightly apart from the story, where a corridor ends too neatly, where a designation reads non-public, as if that were an architectural feature rather than a decision. The Winter Garden holds its light the way a museum prefers: clean, elegant, harmless. But beneath that elegance, the older logic persists: quiet, functional, unnamed. A system designed for a northern climate and a rigid social order does not disappear, simply because it is no longer discussed. If you have followed this far, consider what weighs more as evidence: the word subway itself, the circulation logic that makes such a term plausible, or the institutional habit of renaming power until it becomes safely tourable. Leave your thoughts below. Every careful interpretation helps illuminate what history tried to bury. And if this story resonated with you, let us know. It tells the algorithm these forgotten halls are worth exploring again. Subscribe quietly so that you're here when the next sealed door finally opens. Because Glen Sheen is not alone in this. America's great houses learned the same discipline in different accents, behind different facades, with different files kept out of sight. And if you're willing to step deeper into the shadows, the next chamber awaits. For some legacies endure not because they are innocent, but because they were administered. Some secrets survive only because those who feared them left no one to tell the truth.